Hi everyone, welcome to part 2. Okay, so next we can look at maneuvering when circumstances become difficult. For example, when your own center is in need of protection. This position was reached by the great world champion Lasker with white against Salva in St. Petersburg in 1909. White has a very nice position after 26 moves with the black king position and the d6 pawn. Both glaring weaknesses to attack. However, white also has a weakness on e4, and this means that he's slightly restrained in what would otherwise be a winning attack. Moreover, he does not have much space with which to maneuver against the d6 weakness. For the moment, it can only be attacked via a heavy piece on the d file, or diagonally, sorry, the d file's here, or diagonally, as the queen is doing at the moment, i.e. the knights are unable to adjoin this attack for the time being. It appears that it's more advisable to attack on the king side, where the queen and rook in particular can shift the files that they occupy as they please, and thereby alternating the pressure. In Nimzowicz's view, it takes great skill in order to execute a successful maneuvering operation in this position, given the limited framework, but Lasker, a maestro of piece play, was able to do just that. For the moment it's black to play, and Salva increased the pressure on e4 with queen e8. So how should white continue? If you want to try and figure it out, then stop the video here. Queen f2 is the move he played, which is better than the more natural knight f4 in order to play a knight g6 check, winning the rook, because now black can play knight h6. So queen f2, rook f8, and now queen d2, and in this manner white is able to retain the pressure on d6 and play knight f4 next. In the previous line, if with knight f4 and knight h6, it's only possible because from f4 the knight is interrupting the queen attacking d6. So if the knight moves now, then d6 is just going to drop. So black plays queen b8, overprotecting d6. So king h1, now rook f e8, trying to keep the pressure on e4, but now comes rook g4 with pressure on g7, so black has to move back. Rook g8. If he plays knight h6, then knight takes f6 is possible, because from d2 the queen is attacking the knight, and knight f6 is obviously removing the defender. If gf6, queen h6, and white wins. So rook g8, and now rook d1, and through the pressure white has forced the g8 rook away from its attack on e4, so now white has more freedom to attack himself. So queen b4, and this is a mistake from Salva, definitely preferable was queen e8 instead. So queen f2, and Lasker's positional judgment is great. He's not concerned with allowing this queen penetration into his position, queen c3, which is what Salva played, because after queen h4 white has an improved version of the position we saw at the beginning, and it's questionable what the black queen is doing on c3 despite penetrating the white position. So knight h6, and now rook f4, overprotecting f5. They used to say of Lasker that he could pick up a set of chess pieces, throw them in the air, and that they would all land on the right squares. If he was in the process of a game, he could lift his piece up, throw them in the air, they'd land on the right squares. And this game appears to be an example of that style. I mean, they're not necessarily posts you would choose for the pieces, but they're all on ideal squares. And if he plays rook g3 instead, then black can sacrifice on f5, because of the position of the queen and rook. So knight f7, now king h2, rook g e8, queen g3. Again, applying the pressure to g7. And you know, black would love to play g6 here, but of course Lasker has made sure that's not possible by getting this pawn to f5. So rook g8, now rook h4, an accurate move. It's tempting to play rook g4 instead, but now black can play knight h6, and if, for example, rook h4, d5, and suddenly things are fluid and more liberated than white would like. So e d5, c d5, rook d5, bishop c6, and the pressure is gone from black. He's given up a pawn, but he's going to have good compensation. So rook h4, g5. Salva lashes out given the threat of knight f4, and if knight h6, then rook d6. And it should be noted that if he tries to liberate here, as in the previous example with d5, he runs into trouble. d5, cd5, cd5, knight f4 with the threat winning the exchange on d5, and white is just much better here. So rook h4, g5, fg6, rook g6, queen f2, attacking f6, so f5, just liquidating that weakness. Knight f4, attacking the rook, has to defend. Rook f6, knight e2, attacking the queen. Queen b2, now rook d2, solving some positional problems. Queen a1, now knight g3, king g8, because white was threatening quite a deep combination. ef5, bishop f5, knight f5, rook f5, and then rook takes h7 check, and if king takes h7, queen h4 check, winning the loose rook on e7. So king g8 to avoid that. So e takes f5, bishop takes f5, and now a very nice move, knight d4. It's pinning the bishop, because the queen and the rook facing each other, and it's forcing the play. White's going to get the pawn back with an advantage after c takes d4, knight takes f5, king f8, and queen takes d4. His knight's pinned, so he can't take on e7. Queen takes d4, knight takes d4, and white's going into a very favourable endgame. After knight e5, he has to defend c6, and it's also just a good central square. Rook h5, rook ef7, now c5, undermining the knight. dc5, rook e5, cd4, rook d4. Rook f2 check, rook d8, king g7, now rook a5, defending a2 from the rook, and white went on to win. It's a very instructive play from Lasker, and you know, despite the complexity of the position, he manages to keep control of the entire board and minimize the effect of his own weakness, the e4 pawn in particular. What's very instructive about this particular game was that it was difficult for white to attack the black weaknesses directly, but the fact that black had two major weaknesses compensated for this considerably. What's also instructive is that Lasker was able to play around his own weakness. Many times club players will be reluctant to play a variation that will give them a notable weakness of some kind, but this is incorrect on the principle that it's more important to assess how relevant these weaknesses will be in relation to the play on the rest of the board, and in particular to our opponent's weaknesses. Okay, so now we can look at some examples, some sample games to illustrate further the ideas of maneuvering that we've looked at so far. So this first example was played by Nimzowitsch with the black pieces against Takeman in San Sebastian in 1911. It's an instructive example of combined play on both wings, as well as another case of playing actively despite having to defend a weakness. So Takeman opened with e4, Nimzowitsch played e5, knight f3, d6, the Philidor defense, and now d4, knight f6. These days e takes d4 is preferred, but this is also playable. Knight c3, knight b d7, bishop c4, bishop e7, castles, castles, queen e2, c6. Both players just developing naturally. Bishop g5. White has more space and more freedom, especially with his bishops, but black is fairly solid. So h6, putting the question to the bishop. Bishop h4, knight h5. He wants to play knight f4, bishop g3. So knight takes g3, h takes g3, and b5. And white could have prevented this move by playing a4 instead of when he played bishop g5, and this was definitely preferable. Black now has the bishop pair and good fluidity with his pawns, which complicates white's task of attacking. So bishop d3 and now a6, because he wants to play c5, but if he does that before a6, then b5 is going to drop. And it also means that white has to calculate what happens if black breaks with both d5 and c5 at every turn, which obviously makes it very hard to calculate exactly what the best way to play is, which obviously a good thing as far as black is concerned. So a4, Takeman aims to resolve this situation immediately, but Nimzowitsch has foreseen this and continues with bishop b7, so we can keep this set up with the pawn on b5, sorry. So rook a d1, now queen c7, a takes b5, a takes b5, g4. And you know, white may as well try and use this doubled pawn as a battering ram, so he can just liquidate it and then his pawn structure is sound again. And meanwhile he can try and do something with it. So rook f e8, and the idea is to play d5 next, which is going to give white some tactical issues with the queen facing the rook. And you know, though hindered here on b7, the bishop is doing a good job of supporting the central play with d5. So here Takeman played d5 himself simply to prevent black from playing d5. So b4, and this is forcing the play, because if the knight moves then d5 is dropping. So d takes c6, bishop takes c6, knight b1, now knight c5. Very nice play from Nimzowitsch. This is a secure outpost thanks to the pawn here on b4. Knight bd2, and now queen c8, attacking g4. And so if we take a look at the position for a moment, black has this weakness on d6, but it's easy to defend with the bishop on e7, and meanwhile the bishop pair is starting to look pretty good, and black also has the a file. So Takeman defended the g-pawn tactically with bishop c4, and Nimzowitsch played g6. If he plays queen takes g4, then bishop takes f7, king takes 7, takes f7, and knight takes e5 with check is winning the queen. So g6, now g3, king g7, and black's intentions should be clear. Knight h2, and now bishop g5, and black can leave the defense of d6 for a moment with the preference of attacking e4. Takeman played f3 in order to defend, because obviously the threat is taking on d2 and then taking on e4. And if he lashes out with f4 instead, he runs into trouble after e takes f4, g takes f4, bishop f6, and this is winning a pawn. One way or another. Okay, so after f3, play queen c7 with the idea of playing knight a4 to attack b2, and if white plays rook b1, sorry, knight a4 is here obviously, and if white plays rook b1, then bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, and bishop takes e4 is going to be possible, because he'd be attacking the loose bishop here on c4 with the queen. So rook f e1, rook h8, knight df1, and now h5. And Nimzowitsch is taking over all of the important files and diagonals as play progresses. So g takes h5, rook takes h5, bishop d5, rook a h8, bishop takes c6, queen takes c6, queen c4, so attacking b4. So queen b6, now king g2, because black was threatening a nasty discovered check from the queen. Knight d3, winning the rook amongst others. So now black is looking very good. If his knight was on d4, he would be able to play a combination where the rook takes h2, meaning that meanwhile the white pieces are looking tied down and inactive. So Nimzowitsch played knight e6 with knight d4 coming next. So rook e2, an accurate move. If there was no threat of knight d4, etc., then rook d5, and white would probably be able to defend. For a taste of the venom that lies in the position, we can see what happens if white plays, for example, c3. Instead, black has a crushing continuation. If you want to try and find it, then stop the video now. Bishop f4 is the move, and white is now completely busted. The threat is bishop takes g3, where if king takes g3, queen g1 is mate, and if knight takes g3, then rook takes h2 is also leading to mate. And if he takes the bishop, then knight takes f4 check, king g3, and then queen g1 is again mate, and the only other move is king h1, but now queen f2 is forcing mates. So we can see that white has to be extremely careful in how he defends. So rook e2, now knight d4, just play with tempo, attacking the rook, although bishop f4 was actually even stronger. So rook e1, and white should have probably tried an exchange sack here, but his position is lost in any case, and it should be noted if he plays rook f2 and bishop e3 is just winning the rook. So rook e1, and now queen b7 is a great move. The idea is rook c8, which can't actually be stopped, and black is playing on weaknesses on both sides of the board, the weak king and also the weakened queen side with the knight on d4. Rook c8 is going to win a pawn with check. So all of his pieces are just working beautifully here. So rook takes d4. It's white's only practical chance anyway. And it should be noted if, for example, c3 to try and defend, then b takes c3, b takes c3, and queen b2 check is forcing mates. If queen takes c3 instead, then rook c8. For example, queen d3, rook c2 check, knight d2, bishop takes d2, rook takes d2, rook takes d2, queen takes d2, and now rook takes h2. The sting at the end of the combination, knight takes f3 is coming next, winning the queen. So rook takes d4, e takes d4, and now knight g4. If queen takes d4, bishop f6, queen takes d6, rook d8, and this is completely winning for black. Knight g4, queen b6, f4, and now comes some simplification and nice grinding play from Nimzowitsch. After bishop e7, rook d1, f5, knight f2, fe4, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, rook takes d4, and d5 to hold on to this pawn. So g4, bishop c5, rook d1, now rook h4, and this is ensuring that black doesn't lose a pawn because of the threat of bishop takes f2 and rook takes g4 if rook takes d5. And this is the course that the game actually followed. Rook d5, bishop f2, king f2, rook g4. And black's play is very instructive because in order to keep his advantage, he had to combine pressure on the white king with play in the center through pushing the d pawn and placing the bishop on c5. So play continued, king e3, rook c8. Nimzowitsch switches to the queen side, where his b4 pawn is still doing a great job of restricting white. King takes e4, rook c4 check, king d3, rook cf4, and now we have a technical position that Nimzowitsch won with relative ease. Knight e3, rook g3, and so on, attacking the rook, which is tied to defending the knight. If you see what I mean. So now, yeah, rook e6, and this is forcing off material. Rook e6, king e6, knight d5, g5. And Tigman resigns. A fantastic game from Nimzowitsch that apparently was famous in Denmark at the time. Okay, so we had a look at one of Laska's games earlier. Now we can look at a full game. This was played against Bern at St. Petersburg in 1909. Laska had the white pieces and opened with e4, and came e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, the Roy Lopez, now one of the main lines, which is still played nowadays. And so it's defending e5, so knight a5 is possible to win the bishop pair. If he plays that before d6 and he drops e5, so c3, knight a5, bishop c2, c5, d4, and queen c7, pressure down a c file. Standard kind of approach for black. Knight bd2, knight c6, knight f1, and here Bern routinely castled, but Nimzowitsch preferred cd4, cd4, and bishop g4, which is forcing white to make a decision with what to do in the center. Oops, hold on now. Yeah, so Bern castled here. So then Laska played knight e3, and he's going to play knight d5 to occupy the center. So bishop g4, and okay, he was going to play knight d5, but now he can change his plan, as his idea now will be to utilize the bishop pair. If he plays instead knight d5, then queen a7 adds pressure to d4. He doesn't want to trade instead knight d5, e d5 is just awkward for black. So yeah, after queen e7, knight takes e7, knight takes e7, black is keeping up the pressure here. But anyway, in the game, knight g4, so knight g4, now h3, knight f6, bishop e3, supplying more pressure to c5, knight d7, and it's noteworthy how neither player wants to exchange or push their pawns, as they both understand that this will make it much simpler for their opponent. Exchanging may even hand the other player the advantage and the pressure. So queen e2, bishop f6, rook a d1, knight e7, bishop b1, knight b6, a3, knight g6. Slowly Laska is building an advantage. g3, rook f e8, and black at the same time is preparing to play d5, and white is trying to keep him restrained and maintain the central tension until this point, actually, where he felt that to allow black to play d5 was too much, so he plays it himself. Generally, white wants to hold the tension for as long as possible, and black wants to relieve the tension at a favorable moment, as a kind of general rule. So knight d7, now king g2, and queen d8. And Nimzowitsch questioned this move, preferring c4 with knight c5 next. And the knight's going to be well placed here, should white play, for example, for f4, and so on, because it's attacking e4, and it's also supporting play against these pawns here. As it turned out, f4 and so on didn't happen in the game, but a knight on c5 would be a good thing regardless. But anyway, his opponent played queen d8, so now h4, bishop e7, now h5, knight gf fade, and Laska's idea should be becoming clear. He's going to swing a rook to h1 and push forward safely on the king side. It's completely risk-free, and the closed center means that he can afford to undertake this action on the flank. So rook h1 and now h6. Prophylaxis, of course, but this is also weakening. Rook dg1. Laska is going to attack en masse. Meanwhile, black has very little activity, a horrible position, and a horrible prospect to be faced with for the rest of the game. So knight h7, making sure that white's not going to play g5 anytime soon. King f1, king h8, rook h2, rook g8. Bern clearly wants to make absolutely sure Laska has nothing on the king side. So knight e1, knight is coming to c2, where it's going to significantly slow down any queenside play for black, and later it can come to e3, which is going to be a great post. You know, knight f5 is always in the air, especially now that this h5 has been played. And it should be noted here too that knight h4 might look tempting to get the knight to f5 more quickly, but black can exchange. And after rook takes h4, the position is starting to look a little bit rigid, and you know, Lasker understands this well and instead opts to build up pressure more slowly. So knight e1, rook b8, knight c2, a5, and now bishop d2 is a very nice play. How now black is halted on the queen side as well. He can't ever play b4 unless he wants to give up material. So bishop f6, now f3, knight b6, and rook f2. White wants to play knight e3, but he wants to be able to play f4 if black plays bishop g5, and this is why Lasker played a rook f2 here. So knight c8, king g2, queen d7, king h1, knight e7, rook h2, rook b7, rook f1, rook e8. And you know, there's no need to rush here with white. He can play slowly and wait for black to lash out or try something rash, but Byrne is refusing to bite. So knight e3, knight g8, f4, bishop d8, and now queen f3. And achieving this f4 push is good for white, but it doesn't bring any huge advantage right away. However, the black pieces are tied to guarding against strong threats such as knight f5 and a pawn advance on the king side, crushing black completely. And this restraint on the black pieces means that they'll be poorly placed should white suddenly break through on the queen side. And that factor is exactly why Lasker has laid siege to the king side, in order to break the contact between the black pieces and the queen side. Now he will play c4 if allowed, and gain growing advantages. Black will have glaring weaknesses, and the white bishops will quickly begin to gain in strength. White has ideas, for example, after a4, if black plays b4, then bishop c2, queen d1, bishop a4, c6, and that kind of thing. And perhaps seeing such ideas, Byrne was now inclined to play c4 himself, but this means that a4 undermining c4 is good for white. So bishop b6, perhaps aiming to trade off the knight on e3. So a takes b5, and now queen takes b5, and this is a bad mistake from Byrne, who's crumbling under the pressure. Much better was bishop takes e3, bishop takes e3, queen takes b5, followed up with a4 and rook a8, where black has some glimmers of hope to hold the game. So queen b5, and now knight f5. Black doesn't have the chance to trade now, and this is threatening to win d6 and also the exchange. So queen d7, and now queen g4 is threatening mate on g7, pretty much forcing f6 to defend with the queen. But now white's position is virtually winning. The knight here on f5 can never be evicted. Black would love to play knight e7, but of course he's just going to get mated if he does that. And moreover, black has serious weaknesses on the queen side as well. The c4 pawn is looking very sickly, and there are many tactical problems too, as we'll see. So bishop c2, bishop c5, now rook a1 with the idea of bishop a4, so winning the exchange. So rook e b8, now bishop c1, immediately neutralizing the b-file pressure. Queen c7, now bishop a4, and the light squares have suddenly become a huge problem for black. Queen b6, rook g2, rook f7, now queen e2, attacking c4, so queen a6, now bishop c6, threatening b4 with serious problems for black. But you know, he at the same time is trying to defend, and he's made knight e7 possible now. Well, actually Lasker helped in that, but he has the option to play knight e7, and he's glad to get it in. So knight e7, rook e7, now rook at a4, ganging up on c4. It's very clear and a lucid play from Lasker. So e takes f4, and black is cracking under the pressure. This is a very dangerous decision. So g takes f4, f5 is trying desperately for counterplay, given the prospect of losing the pawn on c4. But this is completely unsound, and he's just, in desperation here, more or less. So e5 simply, and his advantage continues to grow. Knight f6, exploiting the pin, and now rook takes c4. And this is, have to be slightly careful about playing this, because it's pinned now, the queen here, but Lasker has judged it correctly. Knight g4, so it's a nice outpost, but not so much use on its own. Yeah, the knight is good, but it can't really do much without other pieces attacking in conjunction. And so white can now go into a winning endgame with an exchange sacrifice. The rook takes c5, queen takes e2 is forced, because the queen's hanging. So rook takes e2, and now d takes c5 and d6. And white has a pawn for the exchange, but more importantly, he has connected pass pawns, and this is now completely winning. So rook a7, e6, rook a6, e7, no need to worry about the bishop. Knight f6, d7, and it's absolutely hopeless for black. Byrne played knight takes d7, but after bishop takes d7, he had no choice but to resign. So it was a superb game from Lasker, and a great example of how to fight in order to gain space for the bishop pair, as well as tying up your opponent and utilizing a space advantage with greater piece mobility. Okay, so now we can have a look at another one of Nimzowicz's games. This was a consultation game played by Nimzowitsch against 3 players who could confer with one another as part of a simultaneous display, with 4 such games going on at the same time. His opponents opted for e4, and Nimzowitsch went into the French, which is one of his favorite openings. So e6, d4, d5, and knight c3. And amusingly enough, Nimzowitsch borders on criticizing this move, implying that pushing to e5 is the correct way to play, which is kind of what he worked on during his lifetime, and spent a lot of time figuring out why e5 was a good move, which was kind of hotly contested at the time by people like Tarrasch and so on. But it's kind of ironic, because nowadays knight c3 can more or less be considered the main line in today's play, whereas the advanced variation with e5 is considered a little bit drawish. So what's the refutation of knight c3 in Nimzowicz's view? Bishop b4, the winner, which a very double-edged and risky choice from black, but the sharpest lines weren't played back then. So bishop d3 is not really normal nowadays. e5 and a3 is how white plays. So knight c6, attacking d4, so threaded c takes d4 and queen takes d4, knight takes d4. So knight g e2, knight g e7, castles, castles, e5, and now knight f5. Very dynamically played by Nimzowitsch. White doesn't want to trade, or black will have a very nice game, so the team decided to defend d4 instead. Bishop e3, now f6. It's kind of a crucial move to play in many lines of the French, especially the advance, of course. And now in Nimzowicz's view, black has already overcome his opening problems, and it's difficult to disagree with that. So bishop takes f5, handing black the bishop pair and lots of chances in the center. It's a strange decision. Double pawns aren't really relevant. E takes f5, f4, and now bishop e6, blockading the passed pawn immediately. And this is a comfortable square for the bishop. It's not very active at the moment, but that will change later. So knight g3, bishop takes c3, b takes c3. Black gives up the bishop pair in favor of securing strong outposts and a concrete strategy. Now he can play knight a5 with knight c4 coming in due course. But Nimzowitsch notes here that it was with considerable reluctance that he chose this move, because there remains the possibility of central play for white, and therefore, according to the rules of my system, a flank attack should not be undertaken if your opponent can attack in the center. However, there's no way that white can force black to take on e5, and this only leaves the idea of taking on f6 and then using the e5 square. And that's not easy to do very quickly. And Nimzowitsch had correctly calculated that should that happen, he'll be able to call up reserve troops to deal with it, despite the knight being committed to the queen side. So queen d3, queen d7, rook f3, g6, knight e2, rook f7, h4, h5. So black is willing to give up this weakness to attack in return for creating a bind on the king side. So king h2, rook a f8, and these are the reserve troops about which Nimzowitsch was talking. His setup may appear strange, but it's now very solid. So rook g3, and white is ready to mount pressure on the weakness he's secured, but Nimzowitsch has a good understanding of what's going on here, and the direct threats are not possible. Sorry, the direct threats that are possible. He has to defend g6, so king h7, and now knight g1. It's a nice move. The knight is headed to either g5 or e5 after taking on f6. And now we can see why Nimzowitsch had some concern about playing knight a5. There's definitely some pressure here. With knight g1, Nimzowitsch saw that his opponents were well versed in the art of maneuvering, and therefore considered them opponents he had to take seriously. So rook g7, and the need to overprotect f6 is clear. He needs the flexibility for his defenders here. So knight f3, and now queen a4. Finally, black is able to continue the attack he had in mind when he played knight a5. And should be noted, that Nimzowitsch absolutely will not play for the initiative until he's sure his opponent has nothing himself. And this is a mistake that beginners often make, always trying to attack when in fact they should be defending or holding tight. Tigran Petrosian, one-time world champion, was hugely inspired by Nimzowicz's ideas of prophylaxis and restraint, and he took them to the utmost extremes, becoming arguably the hardest player to beat in the history of the game, and one of the most unique of the world champions. So e takes f6, rook takes f6, knight g5 check, king g8, bishop g1, knight c4. Such play from black requires nerves of steel. Concrete calculation is most certainly needed, given this pressure on the position, especially now the e-file is open. Rook e1 and bishop d7, and with this brilliant retreat, black's strategy becomes clear. According to Nimzowicz's system, the ideal purpose of occupying an open file with a heavy piece, especially a rook, is to penetrate to the 7th or 8th ranks, and this move ensures that that will never be possible. The g3 rook is prevented from coming to e3 by the knight on c4, and the only thing that remains is how to find active play from here. So white continued with knight f3, and now bishop b5. Some more prophylaxis. This time he's stopping knight e5. Obviously he can just take, and white can't recapture because his queen's attacked. So queen d1, now queen takes a2, and the pressure is successful in winning a pawn, although black is giving up the e-file. So queen e2, knight d6. But as before, how does white penetrate? It does indeed look dangerous to allow white to occupy the only open file. Excuse me. But as long as he cannot penetrate, the occupation of the file is nowhere near as strong as it might otherwise be. So queen e5 and knight e8, another amazing move. Now black wants to play rook d6 and knight f6 in order to regroup his pieces to better squares and consolidate the extra material. With this in mind, white should now play knight g5 so that rook d6 can be met with queen takes e8 and mate to follow. The amateurs, however, played knight d2, but this isn't right. Nimzowitsch gave an interesting line to illustrate some peculiarities in the position. If white does play knight g5, black can continue, for example, with bishop c6, and although white has the e-file, it's a little clumsy and the queen is not well placed. For example, rook g e3, queen takes c2, or if instead rook e2, queen c, after bishop c6, if rook e2, queen c4, and black has a lovely blockade on the position. For example, rook g3, a5, and black is winning. If knight e6, rook e7, and there's nothing else useful to try on the e-file. So despite white playing the obvious positional moves, it appears to be a misguided strategy. Okay, so back to the game continuation. Knight d2 is the last move. So now rook d6, c4, bishop d7, rook c3, now knight f6. Black has successfully regrouped, and now the amateurs blundered horribly with a c takes d5, allowing knight g4 check, winning the queen, after which they resigned. But after something else like queen e2, rook e6, queen d1, rook g e7 looks very promising for black. So it was a great game from Nimzowitsch and an instructive example of accurate strategy coming out ahead of routine positional play, which is always good to see. Okay, so now we can look at a couple of endgames. This position was reached by Nimzowitsch with black during a simultaneous exhibition. Black attacked first on the queen side, getting the pawn to a4 with clear ideas to invade there. However, he switched his attention to the king side once it became clear that it was the better place to search for the initiative. So now we come to an interesting moment with black to move. If you'd like to try and find Nimzowitsch's move, then stop the video here. b5 is what he played, resulting in great excitement from the spectators, probably because they simply could not understand it, as black has his pieces set up on the king side and therefore he should be attacking there instead. In actual fact, there are many good moves here. f5 was also very strong, but Nimzowitsch's move has a specific point which will become clear shortly. After c takes b5, played rook h2 with the monstrous threats of knight takes g2 and knight h3 check, which is going to win the rook, because the queen's stacking it, the king can't maintain the defense. So white accepts the exchange, rook takes h2, and now if he wants to defend soundly, he must play bishop f1. But because of black's move and apparent pawn sack b5, he can now play bishop takes b5, which removes the defender of g2. So that's a very nice idea. Bishop takes b5 was played, but it's a blunder. He should play king g1 instead, but his position is still hopeless. So knight h3 check with a forced mate to come. White played king f1 as shortening the agony. If he plays king e2 to keep the rook, then rook takes g2 is winning quickly. So king f1, queen takes e3, queen e1, queen g1 check, king e2, queen takes g2 check, and white resigned as it's made in two. Very nice and aggressive play from Nimzowitsch. Okay, so this was reached by Nimzowitsch again with black, this time against Seifert in Leipzig in 1926. Black is doing well here and he has the move. His rook is attacked by the knights, and what should he do is the question. Nimzowitsch shows h4, giving up the exchange, although the engines don't like this, feeling that black is giving away a healthy advantage and that he should play something like rook g6 instead. So knight takes g3, h takes g3, rook d2, and Nimzowitsch now advances on the other side, a5, with a specific idea in mind. you can stop the video and try and find it. You'll have to look fairly deeply to figure it out, especially because it isn't actually forced. So b5 is what Seafoot played, and this is a mistake actually. He should play c5 instead here. Now black has a powerful bishop takes h3, and very surprisingly Seafoot accepted the bishop. He should play just c5 instead, although black is now better in all lines after bishop e6, simply if he doesn't take the bishop. So g takes h3, queen takes h3 check, king g1 is forced, and now we see the point of black's a5 push. He can play d5, and white is actually forced to resign. There's no way to stop bishop c5 check, which is forcing mate. White's playing b5 of course makes this possible, and this is why he had to play c5 instead. So a very nice conception from Nimzowitsch, although it was helped in no small part by his opponents. So this example closes the second half of the book and brings an end to our study of Nimzowicz's My System. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it instructive. I'm certain that studying myself has greatly improved and enriched my game, and I hope that you can say the same. Nimzowitsch was a great master of the game, and we owe him due credit for discovering these brilliant ideas and sharing them with us. It's a testament to his greatness that they're still very much a part of the game 100 years later, and it's hard to imagine a day when that won't be the case. So that's it for now. I'll be back with more videos soon. Thanks very much.